Hey guys, so today we're going to be kind of starting week 2, and this whole week is sort of about talking about the relationship between writing and research, and using that to, hey guys, so this week we're really talking about the relationship between writing and research, and talking about the kind of research that we're going to be doing in class, the inquiry-based research, and kind of getting started talking about your inquiry project that we're going to be working on this semester, and all that fun stuff. So we're going to start with this short presentation on writing and research. And we're going to start actually with writing, do a little bit, and then segue into research. So you just did a little Padlet reading response, and some reading talking about kind of writing situations and how like writing is a conversation and how research is a conversation. So you should be a little bit prepared for some of the things that I'm going to be kind of talking about. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about just writing situations. And sometimes I'll say communication situations. Sometimes I'll say rhetorical situations. And I don't know if you've ever really done much kind of talking before about what we mean when we say rhetoric. Sometimes you'll hear rhetoric as meaning like persuasion, but we typically think of rhetoric just as like communication, the way somebody is getting their ideas across. So really, like when you think about writing, it's still a kind of communication, just in a really specific way. So sometimes we'll say like composing situation, writing situation, rhetorical situation, and it all kind of refers to the same context. You have a writer or a communicator or a speaker, somebody on the giving end, and you have a genre or a text, whether it's a blog, a presentation, a paper, a conversation, a post on social media, and you have an audience, the person on the receiving end. And we engage in these sort of like writing situations all the time. Like whether we realize it or not, it's kind of an everyday thing that just sort of passes us by. So for instance, like social media. Okay, so I'm old and I use Facebook. And pretty much only Facebook. So you'll have to translate my Facebook examples to your own social media because I don't follow. So I'm going to talk about Facebook. So let's say you post on social media that day that you're not feeling well. Well, in that case, you're still the writer, the communicator. You have something you want to accomplish. You have a purpose. Typically, what you're wanting is for your audience to comment back, right? And to say things like, oh, I'm sorry you don't feel well. Oh, I hope you feel better. Oh, we love you and we're thinking about you. Thoughts and prayers, like all that stuff. And it's going to give you a boost for the day. Make you feel good, make you feel loved, make you feel important. And that's the goal. You were a communicator with a purpose. You had a genre or a text you were using, and you had an audience, and that was a writing situation. So a lot of different things that we're involved in every day sort of simulate the same thing that we're doing with maybe what we might think of as like more complicated writing situations, like papers or essays or presentations, that kind of thing. But all writing situations has this kind of context, where there's this situation, there's a purpose, a reason for the writing, and then there's the writer, the text that you're using, and the audience, and there's some sort of a goal. But you may sometimes notice, and this was one of the questions that I asked you in your Padlet reading response, that writing doesn't always feel very much like a conversation, especially when it's something like assigned for class. And you might almost consider like my social media example as a completely different kind of thing from the writing that happens in class. And I guess because in class, I think it feels like you're assigned something, and you might be like, if you're assigned a newspaper article, to write this newspaper article, you're not really, I mean, I guess you could, but for the purpose of that class, you might not really be trying to publish it. Like the audience doesn't feel real. It feels like you're, I guess, kind of writing in a vacuum. And especially if you've used like writing formulas before, like a 5-paragraph essay, things that were very plug and play. You didn't really have a lot of choices to make as a writer, and you didn't really have to think about the audience very much, because again, you just like plug stuff where it goes, and I guess that's it. And I guess, class can only provide a simulated writing experience and try to make it as realistic as possible so that you're making those choices and having to think about an audience. So one of the things that we'll be kind of doing in this class is trying to work within a simulated real world context, as realistic as we can get, where you choose your own question the way that you would if you were a real, researcher or a real scholar. You'll work with 2 different styles of writing that are academic genres. And in your final essay, the digital essay, you'll be asked to choose your own purpose, your own genre, your own audience, and everybody's essays will look wildly different because you'll have to think about what choices you need to make as the writer. So hopefully putting you into as realistic a situation as possible. So I want to break down the 3 main components that are in a writing situation. Every time you go sit down to write, or you start to have a conversation, or you're planning a presentation, any sort of writing or communication situation, you have a kind of context or reason that you're doing it. It could be, for a class, you're submitting an article for a certain reason, you're conducting a study. But there's 3 kind of main things that you have to think about that are going to kind of guide your decision making and how you're going to work through that writing situation and use our first key writing skill, your rhetorical knowledge. And the first one is just the writer and figuring out what your purpose is. And the other one is your genre or the text that you're using, and then the audience. So when I'm thinking about the writer or the purpose, sometimes I'll say, I'll ask you, what is your end game? What is your goal? When you write this paper or someone is reading this, what is it that you want to happen? What are you wanting them to take away? Are you wanting them to laugh? Are you wanting them to, agree with you or see where you're coming from? Are you wanting them to have as much information as possible and be more knowledgeable? What's the actual goal of this text? And that's sort of that first piece of the puzzle. And sometimes each time you sit down to write, you might have a different purpose, and that purpose is going to guide some of your strategies and things as you move through working through that text. I'm going to actually skip genre and text for now, and I'm going to bounce over to audience. And one of the things that was in your reading also, and one of the questions that I asked you was to think about some characteristics of your audience that might make a difference. I guess also already sort of talked about the fact that sometimes with writing in class, it can feel like a vacuum and not like there's a real audience. And I said with the digital essay, one of the things we're going to practice is thinking about characteristics of a real audience. So some of the characteristics that might matter, I'm going to look at. The first kind of important one is knowledge and what your readers or your target audience's knowledge base is about the issue. And here's why that matters. Let me give you an example. We tend to assume that every paper has to have several paragraphs of background information where there's just random facts and dates and all kinds of stuff. But the truth is that if you're writing to an audience that feels very strongly in opposition to you, they may already have a certain level of knowledge about the issue. And if you are just boring them with lots of information they already know, they're not going to get very far in the paper. They're not going to read far enough to really hear what you have to say. So even background knowledge that you provide the reader should be based on what you actually think that they don't know already, or what actually needs to be there to catch them up. If you're trying to convince people that something, your audience, that something is a big issue because they don't already know that something is going on, then they might need more background information. But again, like, that can vary depending on who your audience is. Another one is age. Like, for instance, if you were writing a paper about music, and you were writing it to, I'm gonna say, an older audience, like 30s, 40s, up, that kind of thing, and I was part of that target audience, and you were using contemporary music examples, I might not have any idea what you're talking about. You might have to really give me like some images and some song lyrics and some videos, like a lot of extra help if you're going to use those kinds of examples, because I'm not going to follow. Whereas if you're going to talk to, an audience of your peers, you might be able to just throw out, like, names with less information, and they're going to know what you're they're going to know what you're talking about and be able to follow, because you're part of that same group and you have that shared sort of knowledge base. So age can kind of make a difference too. I'm going to throw in a couple of other characteristics. Ethnicity, religion, values, politics. With religion, it could be, does your audience have a specific religion or tend toward a specific religion? Or if not a religion, a specific maybe set of values that might make them interpret the information a certain way, or make them, feel a certain way, or have a certain concern about the issue. Politics, if you're writing about something that's like definitely a political issue, your audience's political affiliation is going to determine possibly their knowledge base, what kind of media they're watching, their concerns, that kind of thing. Culture, gender, socioeconomic status. And you might not think about all of these characteristics every time you sit down to write, but you might be working on a certain issue that's of a political nature, and so your audience's possibly knowledge, their political affiliation, possibly their religion or values, maybe even their age. Those are characteristics of your audience that might make a difference. That might make you have to make certain choices about what content you need to include, what kind of examples you need to include, how much background, catching up needs to be there, what kind of tone you need to use. So all those kinds of things can kind of make a difference. Because remember, the goal is always to achieve this end game, not just to write in a vacuum. The final piece of this is the genre and the text. And when I say genre, I kind of just mean the type of text. Like, are you writing? Is this a blog? Is this a presentation? Is this an essay, an article? Is this like a conversation? And those kinds of things are gonna determine some stuff. I don't know if you've looked at a blog, a presentation, an article, had a conversation, written a text, written a lab report, and annotated bibliography. They're all wildly different because they have some different rules. We talked about that a little bit with knowledge of conventions, and how, like, what is good and what's expected in different fields and different genres can kind of vary. When we looked at the ransom note, we talked about, like, this genre has this purpose to get money and not to get caught, and these are the rules you're supposed to follow. So some of the rules or the expectations for that genre can be style, tone, like, are you supposed to be funny? Is this conversational, casual? Is this supposed to be super objective? Can you use I, personal experience? Is it acceptable? What is your citation style going to be? What's the order of ideas perhaps it's going to be most expected? It might tell you content, like, here's what you use this genre to talk about. Here's what you include. Graphics, format, how it looks. Citations. Oh, I said that twice. Haha, citations. And then grammar. Grammar rules can vary a little bit depending on the genre, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The next thing I kind of want to talk about is kind of looking at these individual writing situations and zooming out and kind of thinking about the conversation as a whole and kind of seeing how each like small text, whether you're reading online or watching the news, it's all these little bitty writing situations that are part of a bigger conversation. And one of the things we're going to work on with the inquiry project is choosing a topic and trying to hear out the whole conversation. And that's why we kind of looked at the Burke's Parlor metaphor in text and thinking about the unending conversations that just sort of kind of go on. And I wanted to kind of look at an example using a topic that not very many people use anymore, which is why I like it. When I kind of like to think about conversations as sort of a round table with lots of people involved in the conversation. I think too often when we're thinking about an issue, we think about it as having sides, as it having like a for or against, a right or a wrong, a good or a bad, a yes or a no, which really kind of oversimplifies it, and it makes the focus on like just two big opinions rather than on all of the people and the voices that are included in that conversation who have lots of opinions and concerns and types of evidence and text and all this gray area that really kind of, I guess, like zooms in and digs in and looks at the whole conversation in more of a complex way rather than just like the surface level of just these two kinds of opinions. So we're gonna do a model of a round table, a conversation. And I'm going to use violent video games in teens. And I want you to think about these X's as being kind of groups of people, maybe in this conversation, people who have a stake in the issue. They care about this issue for a specific reason. So one group of people that might be involved in a conversation about violent video games in teens might be parents. Especially if if you're thinking about teens, so parents might be one group, and they might have an opinion that's, yes or no, maybe, or for or against, but for different reasons with their own stories and their own experiences. Distributors, people who sell video games, they have a stake and they're going to have a set of concerns and a voice for a very different reason than parents. The creators and designers, the people who want, license to make a living and be creative and have autonomy over what they do. News reporters, obviously, because they're the ones that are would be bringing this issue and events to the news and to the media. If you're thinking about like a scholarly voice, like who's going to be part of this conversation, like conducting the studies, that's where you get into your scholars, teachers, possibly administration, gamers themselves. And you could probably get into like politicians and lawmakers and, lots of other people that will be included. But I think, you kind of get the idea that this is more complex than just for or against or right or wrong. And all of these groups of people might have, they, are a part of this conversation for a specific reason with a certain stake. It affects them in some way. But they're also maybe have some differing opinion even among themselves. And if you think about how to go out and research and get these perspectives and these voices, you're going to find that they're producing lots of different kinds of texts that you would have to seek out in order to get this information. So I just did a couple as an example. So parents, you might see some of them in like blogs, interviews, documentaries. If you're looking for even if you did gamers or creators and distributors, you might find them in like gaming specific magazines, documentaries. News reporters would be in the news, obviously. Child psychologists, you might have like studies books, academic blogs, again, like documentaries. Documentaries kind of try to get, everybody. And then, teachers, you might find them on like, again, like interviews, magazine articles, education sites, that kind of stuff. But just so you can kind of see, like, these would be lots of different types of information. and lots of little pieces of this conversation. And one of the things they talk about is, you wouldn't, in a regular conversation, you wouldn't, you know, walk up and start talking without hearing everybody out. That might be repetitive. And people might be confused because you really haven't heard what's going on or know like where the conversation stands and what's happening right now. And that's one of the things that's really important, is to think about the fact that, all of these groups of people have different levels of expertise. They have professional, scholarly, personal kinds of expertise. And it also, they all give you different angles, different ways of coming at this, and a different piece to a really complex puzzle. And our goal by the time we get to the digital essay is to have heard people at the table within your issue and be able to sort of take a space and add something to it, and have enough different types of text and different kinds of information and perspectives to really have a way to make a contribution to the conversation. After looking at that example, there's a couple of kind of takeaways or big, like, points to walk away with. And one is just kind of noticing when you look at that model that whether you're looking at all these different groups and all these different people that have these stakes and different types of expertise, and each one of those you would understand by looking at a different kind of text or an individual text, whether it's a magazine article or a blog or a study or a news article. You would have to go to different places, and each one of these is a little writing situation. And it's important to pay attention to not looking at texts at face value, but reading them as texts written by people, like paying attention to the person behind that text making choices. What is their expertise? What were their strategies? And kind of paying attention to that text as something that needs to be understood and evaluated and questioned and analyzed and compared with other texts in the same conversation. And kind of also noticing how these conversations keep going. And that's one of the things I brought up in the Burke's, with the Burke's parlor metaphor, is that, when you enter this conversation, like it's been taking place for a while. So if you're talking about education, and you're talking about maybe standardized testing, well, the conversations we're having now aren't the same contributions, the same research, the same concerns that were taking place 10 years ago. And in 10 more years, it'll be new concerns, new laws, new policies. And these things are kind of, cyclical and ongoing. So you're trying to step into a conversation that is kind of, unending, and then you're wanting to contribute something to help keep that conversation going, and help, move it in a certain direction. And again, just coming back to thinking about the fact that it's important to hear out all the different levels of expertise that are involved in this conversation, because it lets you know, like, what all of the different concerns and opinions and perspectives are. One of the things I'll say a lot is you can't refute it if you didn't read it. So a lot of times you'll read articles where they'll talk about social media, and they'll talk about movies, and they'll interview, I guess what you would think of as, like, if you watch the news, they'll interview, like, regular people, like walking around on the street, to see what they think about things. And thinking about that as part of the conversation is important. I think a lot of times we want to plan an argument, so we want to just go get the most credible things that support what we have to think, or what we have to say. But if you do that, that's incredibly biased, because you're not really hearing out the whole picture, or getting the whole picture and sifting through and being able to compare it. There might be a documentary that came out that's relevant to your issue that's super biased. But if everybody's seen it, then your reader is going to expect you to address it. And if you can't address it if you didn't watch it. So you kind of have to, hear out first the good, the bad, and the ugly before you can step in and be an expert in the conversation enough to contribute and refute and compare opinions and information. And again, that brings us back to that final takeaway point of just the importance of hearing out the whole conversation. And as we talk more about this, we'll get more into your inquiry project and the fact that before we get to the digital essay where you're trying to enter the conversation and have something to contribute, the goal is to get more material and knowledge and perspective and push those habits of inquiry, those like research skills, evaluation and selection and applying information from sources, and putting you better in that position to critically read, to look below the surface of the text, to see the person behind it, the choices, the strategies behind it, think about what kind of information is being used, and pay attention to potential biases and the things that are making that text work. So always kind of thinking about, again, like the writer behind the thing that you're reading, because you're on the receiving end of that. Like when we're reading, we're doing research, and we're just on the other end of somebody else's writing situation.